I knew I'd forgotten something, which is the black and white photograph of me leaning against the wall looking attractive, but on January the 15th, 2009, US Airways flight 1649, which was an Airbus 320, took off from New York's LaGuardia Airport on a routine internal flight. 2 minutes after takeoff, the co-pilot noticed a flock of geese about 800 meters into the air. 3 minutes after takeoff, the plane hit the geese. So from the cockpit, there were bits of bird, legs and wings and stuff like that. It was a bit like being in the kitchen at KFC. But visibility wasn't really the problem. With the birds going through the engines as well, the plane lost thrust on both sides, which meant that this now was an 140-ton glider. Now the captain was 57-year-old Chesley Sullenberger, and he got a lot of experience, about 20,000 flying hours on the clock, so he was very calm. But his reputation was going to be sorted out in a matter of minutes, about 6 minutes actually. When it was clear that the co-pilot wasn't able to restart the engines, he had a choice to make, although in hindsight it was probably no choice at all. Air traffic control was offering him runways at different airports nearby, but he didn't think he could glide to those, so he decided to look for something that was flat and long enough to land on, and he chose the Hudson River. Now the actual landing beggared belief. He managed to avoid skyscrapers, a very large bridge, and a huge metropolitan area. But he got the plane landed safely, with no one dead, the plane intact, and only a few minor injuries. It's been turned into a film which is still out, directed by Clint Eastwood, which I strongly recommend you should watch. But the reason I mention it is because nothing could have been done about the bird strike. It was an act of God, or probably an act of goose that had caused it. Nothing could have prevented it. But it's what I would call a dramatic example of how to respond to a failure. It's very dramatic and highly unusual, but it's a response to a failure. Because the point I'd like to make tonight is that it's okay to fail, but failure shouldn't be the last thing. Now, because I'm a creative director, and I've always been in the creative industries, I'm going to talk about failures to do with the industry I've been in. Now, one thing that I've noticed relatively recently is we're in a world full of people tweeting about innovation and making t-shirts with slogans on about how ideas are the most important thing in the world, how we should think outside the box, how if we can imagine it, it can be a reality. And I have a feeling if the Martians landed tomorrow and they went onto LinkedIn, they'd be amazed how many slogans about innovation they saw on people's posts. They'd probably think that we all humans needed bigger brains to fit our highly innovative heads in, or the reverse, heads to fit brains in. However, the basic normal response to a new idea is to reject it. We're hardwired to kick things out, to call it a failure, or to point out the shortcomings. It's an animal instinct. Our brains are self-organizing, pattern-making devices that like everything to have a familiarity about them. It doesn't like surprises, and it certainly isn't, by default, creative. When we lived in caves, our personal survival depended on recognizing the difference between friend and foe. If it didn't have a beard and hairy legs, you had sex with it, dragged it around by the hair, and had a nice evening. If it had a bit more hair, you killed it and had it for dinner. And if it was a really good Friday night, you slept with it, dragged it by the hair, then killed it and ate it for dinner. And nowadays we're a bit more cerebral than that, or we think we are, but we're just as quick to reject foreign bodies. things that surprise us. We're taught critical thinking at school, very rarely creative thinking. So the education system, in the West at least, teaches people to actively look for what's wrong and calls it a valuable skill. It's almost like we want to create failure. So what's the solution if failure is the problem? Well, the t-shirts were right. It's creativity. Using Sir Ken Robinson's definition, which is my favourite, that creativity is a process of creating new ideas that have value, there's a little bit in that that bothers me slightly, and that's that the value isn't always noticed at the beginning, because the beginning is often too soon. Ideas are a bit like babies. They pop out quite easily. I've heard. They're full of potential, but you have to be fair and give them a chance to develop and grow into something remarkable. They don't come out finished. History is full of examples of us jumping to conclusions. How they laughed when the Wright brothers wheeled out their contraption, which they called a flying machine. How they pointed in the street when someone rolled up some leaves, set fire to it, and then inhaled the vapours. Smoking seems to have caught on. And what sort of idiot would believe you could send a letter using some kind of imaginary postman and it would arrive on a phone that had no buttons or dials? There's lots of things that we would have kicked out if someone had told us about them at the time. All great new ideas look sensible in hindsight and logical, but you need a lot of foresight to recognise them. Creativity is the antidote to failure, in my opinion. When failure strikes, creativity is the starting pistol to prove the world wrong and make a success. Now sometimes an idea is rejected because it's shit, which is quite right. There's enough bad ideas around as it is. But lots of times, a new idea fails because of a misunderstanding or a misinterpretation. People fail to realise how good they were. For example, and I'm going to really struggle here because I'm going to start talking about video recorders, which some of you may not have even heard of. The video recorder in the black and white days is what people used to record television programs on. And everyone used the VHS system, which was absolutely awful. There was a much better system called Sony Betamax, but Sony made a big mistake. They invented a very small tape that was very neat and fantastic piece of design. The only problem is the tape would only last for an hour. They failed to realise that films normally last for longer than an hour, so people adopted VHS simply because of the tape. Post-it notes arose out of the failure of the original plan, which was to be a non-destructive bookmark for hymn books, I believe. Now they're the most expensive forms of paper on the planet. Another personal experience, a client of mine made loudspeakers like this, but they were made out, the cabinets were made out of wood, very, very expensive to produce. But they got the measurements wrong, and when they came back from the cabinet makers, they were half the size they should have been. So rather than throw them away, they made a speaker that would work in a small enclosure, and this started what's now known as the bookshelf speaker system. Anyway, that's enough about those sort of failures. What about this one? I used to work in what I called the failure industry, which was advertising in the 80s and 90s. I became an advertising copywriter when I was 17. In fact, I failed my exams at school because I had an ad running when I was 16. So I underperformed in every subject apart from English. I went straight into work. And I stayed in the traditional advertising industry for about 25 years. Just so you know, a copywriter, which is what I was, is the person that is part of the team that thinks of the ideas for ads. I was a bit bored the other night, so I calculated that I did on an average week about 100 advertising concepts, whether those be press, TV or radio. So 100 ideas a week on average, sometimes more than that. And by this I mean the ads that I actually presented internally to the creative director. I don't mean the ones I thought of and said that's rubbish and threw them away. 100 a week. So that makes over 100,000 concepts in my career. And I would say that a very small percentage of those, probably less than 5%, ever got made. I think it was Jesus, well I know it was Jesus, that said, it's harder, it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Well, it's actually even harder still to get an ad out of an ad agency because everybody's trying to stop you. My portfolio of work, which is in the shed at home, with a lot of dust on it, has probably got about 30 pieces of work in it, representing my entire career. Now, to get an ad out of an agency, the first thing you have to do is get it past your creative director, which is what I'm supposed to be now. A good creative director spots really good ideas and helps you make them better, and also stops really bad ideas, real stinkers, and stops you wasting your time on them. Because everyone that takes their idea into the creative director thinks they've come up with something great. I had some really great creative directors that I worked for, and I was given huge amounts of opportunities. But I also had a couple of really bad ones that I'd like to tell you about. Bad creative directors, and I know we've got a creative director coming at the end who's probably not one of these, or hopefully not. They create bird strikes on a daily basis. They're almost in the failure promotion business. They get a kick out of it. They rescue defeat from the jaws of victory on a daily basis. I really think they get off on throwing ideas out. When I went to work for Ogilvy in Hong Kong, I worked for a South African Spaniard, or the other way around, called Ricardo. Ricardo really liked me, so the worst thing he ever did to me was throw a tin of Heineken across the room, which bounced off my head, exploded, and sent beer all over the work that I'd spent the weekend doing. But if he really didn't like you or your work, he would unzip his trousers and urinate on it. Ogilvy and Mather. Another guy I worked for in Edinburgh in Scotland would deliberately take a lot of time looking over your work. I took one sentence in for an ad for the speakers. He took 4.5 hours giving me his judgment on it. He'd deliberately do this so that if he knew you were going out, so you would miss your social engagement. On one year I missed the entire Edinburgh Festival because I was writing radio commercials for Stella Artois. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that in those days advertising agencies were full of people who drank a lot of beer, got divorced a lot, and even committed suicide, I'm afraid to say. It was an agency fueled by insecurity, and this is why creative people tend to like awards. I was one of them. I've thrown them all away, but I was addicted to them. So was advertising full of failures? Absolutely not. If you get your ad kicked out, ripped up, urinated on, had beer tipped over it, or insulted by someone else, you get really pissed off. You kick the cat, hit the wall, hit the bottle, but the next thing you do is get out your layout pad and try again. There's always a better idea, and that's something that I found out right from the start. You sit up half the night, you think of another idea, and suddenly the creative director, who yesterday was a total arse, now thinks you're a genius. Whatever your definition of failure, and whether the failure is down to you or someone else, the important thing is that you don't see failure as the end of the process. It's not necessarily the cause of a plane crash. It's not the end of the post-it note. It's not the reason to send the speaker boxes back. It's not the reason to resign from an ad agency just because your work's covered in beer and urine. It's not the end of the world. Learning from failure is fine, but you can do better than that. Failure is your first step along the road to success, if you choose to take it. So I wish you every failure in the world.